and cited numbers, which were true numbers. Context is everything, though. The numbers were that there were at that point about half the number of missionaries that there had been 50 years earlier. Well, what they didn't say, and why that was the case, is that the Methodist Church in particular, some other denominations did this to differing degrees, but the Methodist Church was in leadership in saying, when we evangelize in Africa or Asia or wherever, what we want to do ultimately is to raise up indigenous leadership. And so once there were sufficient church leaders in Africa, in Asia, there was no need for the great white father from America to be the missionary there. And so there was a cutback in the number of missionaries. Well, people within the denomination, leadership obviously, but even rank and file, were not particularly moved by this efforts by the IRD to create dissent on that. And so they turned their attention instead to creating dissent on the issue of homosexuality. And that resulted in, at the General Conference, which meets every 4 years, a statement that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Just that simple statement, but that set off a war. And obviously they had enough votes to pass that, but just barely. It was not a landslide. But nevertheless, it was passed, and the conservatives were able to hold sway and not get that amended in the subsequent years. And that really is at the basis of what the pending schism is all about. There was to have been a meeting of the General Conference this year. Normally it meets in the leap years, but the pandemic precluded that. So it's now scheduled for fall of next year. And the recommendations that go forward is basically there's going to be a denomination carved out of the United Methodist Church to go off on its own with some assistance from the Methodist Church in terms of getting it set up and, internal matters such as pastoral pensions and that will be guaranteed and so forth. My hope in that is that what it will do is to create, two stronger denominations, eliminating the cause of warfare, and each will be able to pursue its own advocacy as it chooses. I have some experience in that. When some years back in Queens, a dispute arose in a very large Black Baptist church, membership about 2,500, and it was between the Board of Trustees and the pastor, who had been pastor for about 12 or 13 years at that point. And it arose because the pastor wanted to create a more youthful leadership structure in the church. The trustees felt that they had life tenure and didn't want any part of that. And so lawsuits started flying back and forth. They embargoed the salaries to the pastor and the other clergy. And, that was kind of the nub of the argument, with of course accusations being traded mutually. The court asked me to preside over a congregational meeting and supervise a voting in the congregation because I was trusted by both sides. And that did occur. And much to my surprise, there were two questions on the ballot. Shall the trustees be dismissed? Shall the pastor be retained? So you could argue that if you wanted the pastor but not the trustees, you would vote yes, yes. If you wanted the other way, you'd vote no, no. The actual vote was no, yes. Retain the trustees, retain the pastor. Well, that didn't work. And 2 months later, the pastor and his associate clergy left to form a new congregation, taking about 600 members with them. Well, today, under new pastoral leadership in both places, 2 years after that, the original church called a new pastor. And the pastor that was involved in this retired about 5 or 6 years ago. But in short order, both congregations began to flourish. The original Calvary is back up to its 2,500 plus members. New Jerusalem Church, which is the church that grew out of it, has got 1,700 members. And, are both doing well, and they're actually cooperating and talking with one another. This is about 20 years after the breakup. So I'm hoping that will be in some way the result of the denominational division, but that remains to be seen.
So, on a personal side, for the Catholics, for a lapse in faith, for example, with Mother Teresa, in her personal writings, her personal letters, she called it the long, dark night of the soul, when there's doubt. So, as a Methodist, how is doubt considered? Is doubt considered beneficial because it might strengthen your faith? Is it considered something to completely avoid? Is it something that you feel embarrassed if you were going to talk about it? Is it something that you're encouraged to talk about so other people can strengthen your position in the community?
Well, first of all, I think it's a normal part of life. There's always going to be some kind of doubt or concern. Is this really the right course or not? As to talking about it, it does happen. I'm not sure that I would say it's encouraged, but it's not discouraged in terms of talking about it within the congregation. Probably is going to be more in small groups or one-on-one type conversations. And I personally think that doubt is something that does in fact strengthen faith, because it causes you to ask the questions. And, and the resolution of the questions usually gives you a clearer direction. And that's true, I think, in any way. You had mentioned before in the introduction of the previous question about the National Council of Churches. I went off into the IRD and the like, but the late 1960s into the early 70s is when conservative Protestant churches really started to grow. And that, I think, was a direct result, not by the neocons or that directly, but of the political issues. There was a lot of turmoil. I mean, you had the protests of the Vietnam War. You had the issues over civil rights, which wasn't as controversial for the most part, at least in non-Southern churches. You also had the sexual revolution, which impacted heavily. And so there were people who just sort of felt that these were issues that were just beyond the pale from a standpoint of faith. And these issues were being presented in the mainline churches as, think about this, make choices. You've got to make choices as to what's right and what's wrong. And these people, for the most part, just simply were overwhelmed by having the responsibility to make a decision or a choice personally. And they tended to form in like-minded places where someone would get up in front and announce with clarity, this is right, that's wrong. This is, black and white, a Manichaean type choice, good and evil. And so they were very happy not to be thrust in the position of having to make moral choices, but rather being told what the proper moral choice is. And that, I think, is what grew into what's become known as the megachurch movement, because they did attract a lot of people. There are a lot of people who really don't want to be bothered to spend the energy, time, or whatever in looking into issues and making decisions. They'd much rather be told this is the right way, this is the wrong way. And of course, what that did quickly was to define not just good and evil for themselves, but good people from evil people. Evil
So,
people being everybody who was not in our group.
so speaking of good and evil people, how would you, as a minister and a Methodist, define what it is to be a good person? And on that same line of thought, do you need to believe in God to be a good and moral person?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think in general, do you have to? Probably not have to. Is it better? I would say that. Um, I think certainly from a standpoint of faith, well, let me back up just a second. Pick up one of John Wesley's devices. He had what's become known as the Wesleyan quadrilateral as to what is the underpinning of one's sense of identity in the faith. And that starts, of course, with scripture. It goes to tradition, what has been the tradition of the church through the ages. What does your reason tell you? And what has been your experience? And the melding of these four elements really defines and is the fertile soil from which one's faith commitment grows. So it's not any one, and it certainly doesn't deny the God-given gifts of the ability to think and reason, nor deny the experiences that you have. Now, the you in this case is probably more the collective you than the individual you, which is one of the problems, and why I think that a morality based upon a faith commitment is somewhat stronger, because if somebody is not in some kind of a disciplined community, such as a faith community, it's all too easy to speculate that what is the moral good is that which would advantage me personally, which gets you into the Ayn Rand kind of nonsense. But I think this is an important thing. The other is that I meant to say this almost at the beginning, but my sense of it is that if you look at the first 5 words in the Bible in Genesis, it makes 2 very important affirmations. The first is, in the beginning, God, and in the beginning, God created. You go a few verses down and you find God created men and women in God's own image. And so each of us, whether in a faith community or not, we as Christians believe that people are created by God in God's image with a spark of the divine and the spark of the holy. And that therefore they are entitled to be members of God's family, the totality of the family, not just this denominational family or another one. And that on the basis of that, if we really and ecumenically, this comes to play this way. The word ecumenical, you probably know, comes from the Greek word oikumene. And a lot of people, if they're asked, what does ecumenical mean? The most common definition word, which is not correct, it means universal, which is actually the meaning of the word Catholic. But ecumenical, or oikumene, points to the place of habitation. How does that get into the theological discussion? Well, if the earth is the creation of God and is the place where God's people, God's family, God's children inhabit, it becomes God's household. And that means to us that everybody is related to everybody else. And that becomes, I think, a moral underpinning of the whole enterprise, because think about life in one's own personal, intimate household, father, mother, children, etc. Within the household, you might have people who are not exactly that nuclear family, but maybe a aunt or uncle or a grandparent or a cousin or somebody that lives there. You might even have some people that you've kind of adopted, and I don't mean it formally, but that's true too. But when you dwell in the household, you dwell there as a family unit, whatever the defining relationships are. And there aren't agreements within every household by a long shot. Sometimes people do things to which others object, sometimes correctly object, sometimes not so. And there may be, profound disagreements. The one difference is that rarely do you ever get to the point where parties refuse to admit that they're part of the same family. However strong the disagreement is, at the end of the day, we're still related, we're still family. And I think that's the metaphor of the relationship that we would see for the world. And of course, if you follow that through, how can one go to a belligerent war with members of their own family? Yet we do, as nation against nation. How do we divide people simply because somebody drew a line on a map and said, we're in and you're out? All of the immigration issues, all of the other racism issues that come, are simply not to be countenanced, in this common understanding. And I really do think that that's certainly for me, and I think in general, that is a common understanding, of an ecumenical ministry. And I guess the other observation I would make is that we sometimes talk about relationships ecumenically and otherwise as being, well, we'll open a window, or, we'll be in our own house, but we've got a door and we'll go and visit in the other house. Whereas the more radical formulation is that ecumenically our task is to tear down the walls that separate us.
And from our conversation from a couple of days ago, you touched on a little bit of that already, just momentarily ago, about the aspect of the more Ayn Rand type of thought about those where we're talking about Methodism right now, where you're demonstrating that Methodism has a higher social concern and you're taking into account the entire community. But you also brought up a couple of days ago when we chatted, those who might be more evangelical, who see their relationship just between God and themselves.
Yeah, and this has certainly been confused in the media today as to what defines Christianity, and constantly looking for the divisions rather than the unities. In the early 1800s in England, there was a thought in theology that grew up really out of a sense of Christian Zionism, and a reading of Revelation among some other texts, and deciding that in order to quicken the return of the Messiah, we needed to see that the Jews were recollected in Israel so that the final battle of Armageddon could take place and they could be annihilated, and that would bring about the return of the Christ. I think that's simplistic, but it's also perverse. And that gave rise to what had become known as Christian fundamentalism. Now, the Roman Catholic Church basically was out of the picture on this. They didn't have any part in it and would have disowned it. That spread to America by the mid part of the 1800s. And there still are, across the board, some interesting accretions that were made. They went through the Bible and did two things. One was to put in these internal captions within chapters, like headings within a section of a chapter. And their intent, I'm sure, was to reflect what that coming couple of paragraphs might talk about. But in the formulation of the title, that obviously had a certain theological bent to it. And those titles obviously were not in the original scriptural text, but they have been repeated virtually in every English translation since then. The other thing is that they decided that they needed to document the creation narrative. And so they took some of the lineage passages in Leviticus and other of the Mosaic texts and calculated that the earth was created in the year 4004 BC, simply by working backwards in the generations, which is, really obviously not only is it non-factual, it's kind of silly because they had to make certain arbitrary decisions as to what constituted a generation, probably 20 years. Not necessarily unreasonable, but certainly not very precise. And the assumption that once you got back to the beginning of humankind, there was nothing much before that. I don't know what they did, with the actual stories of the creation of the planet and so forth. And that took hold, and you'll see that in often in the King James Bible published today. It obviously wasn't in the original King James, as kind of a heading of particularly the Old Testament books of in what year these things were taking place. But to go back to Genesis, you start with the year 4004 BC. This ultimately has given rise to the whole pseudoscience of creationism, and the insistence that the Bible is literally true.
So that brings me to my next question. I'm glad you're bringing this up. From a Methodist perspective, how literally should the Bible be interpreted?
Well, that's an interesting question itself, because the act of interpreting sort of obviates literalism. You can't say something is literally true if you're going to interpret. And the difference between not just Methodism, but most Christian churches, well, probably all churches, including the evangelical and fundamentalists, they interpret the Bible. The fundamentalists, of course, will insist that they don't. It's sort of like Scalia, we're doing the original reading of the Constitution. But that's not true. First of all, it's not hard to find a verse here and a verse there that contradict one another. They were written by different people at different times. How do you reconcile that? How do you deal with metaphor? And clearly the creation stories and the others are more metaphor. They're intended to describe, rather to impute meaning into that which exists now, creation, for example. It's not to describe, but they will go to the point of saying, well, the Genesis says it was in 6 days that God created everything that was created. Well, was a day 24 hours back then? Did he separate, and that's nonsense from a science standpoint. And while the church historically through the centuries struggled often with science on this, it made peace in the Middle Ages finally. I mean, my view, the division in my view is not between a literalist creationism type doctrine versus evolution, but I would say, well, two things. One is I can't possibly fathom how this planet and everything that exists in it could come into being by random chance selection. Something had to guide it, and we call that something God. And in doing that, is God some kind of a magician who simply waves a wand and instantly something appears? Or did he use what the scientists have come to describe as evolution? And I don't think that evolution is incompatible with Christian thought, generally speaking. Obviously, there are fundamentalists who would disagree with that. And this whole effort at literalism and insisting that we're not interpreting, we're just simply reading and applying. Well, they're also reading and applying for the most part individually, whereas the Old Testament scriptures were written by different people in different centuries, and these texts were being used by congregations of the faithful, and the congregations, would find some meaning in them. And sometimes that would wane and the text was kind of disregarded. Those texts where congregations kind of affirmed meaning, and not just in that one congregation, but among many congregations, are what we have come to see as the books of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And they have been tested by congregations and found to be meaningful. There are lots of writings that were in the mix and ultimately got discarded. And that's kind of the way I think it needs to happen now is that if you're out on your own or you roll your own group of people like-minded, you can sort of decide anything for your group, but that's not being tested in a wider audience and with a common shared perception of what's underneath it all, which is, what I'm talking about with creation and the idea that we're family.
So, one last question before I open it up for your questions and the group's questions. In humanism and in ethical culture, which is another group of humanists, there's a lot of secular Jews, Jews who no longer believe in God. And there's a saying in Judaism that you don't have to be a believer in God to be a good Jew. And I know that I mentioned this question the other day, and I think it might be an interesting question. What can Methodism offer non-believers, atheists and humanists and agnostics, as a way to see the world without God to benefit their lives?
Good question, and I'm not really certain what a good answer to that would be. The way you phrased it the other day was, could you be a non-believer and be a Methodist? And I think my answer to that is probably not. Um, the within the church, and I'm pretty confident that this, would be almost all of the churches. Unitarians obviously have a different take on this. But there has to be some sense of faith, commitment, a God understanding. Now, Paul Tillich, major Protestant theologian of the last century, is fond of saying that God is what is your, quote, ultimate concern, which is a kind of a fancy academic way around it. But, do you have an ultimate concern that controls you, that calls you? And again, that gets back to my idea that with ethics and that it's probably certainly more stable, and I would think more responsible if you're working in the context of a larger understanding rather than simply saying, I'm going to go out and decide what's a good thing to do. Our scripture, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. You look at the thou shalt nots, the prohibitions of the 10 commandments, and each of these commandments, against stealing, covetousness, murder, lying, etc. Those are all acts that breach relationship, that break covenant, and undermine trust. And so the whole enterprise is designed to build up covenant and to build up trust. And so you don't want to do things that break it. Now, are those the only things that can break trust? Obviously not. We're very inventive people. But they form the basis of that. Situation ethics, which I don't know if it was coined by Joseph Fletcher, who wrote a book by that title in the 1960s. And his premise is that in each situation, one should do the most loving thing. In other words, there is not an absolute right and wrong. Maybe a few things might be, but like murder, for example. But life is lived in the shades of gray. And this is really what gave rise to the conservative church growth movement in the 70s and beyond, is that they didn't want to see things in gray because they didn't want to spend the time to have to think through that and decide, okay, that, yes, it might be best if we did this over at this one extreme of good, but we want to avoid evil, but nevertheless, there's some elements that, how do we trade that off? And if you do that on your own and make your own choice like that, it becomes a little tricky because it's hard to keep your own self-interest out of that equation.
Thank you so much. So, do we have any questions? not necessarily collecting around what we don't believe in, because in humanism, if we're talking about atheism, sure. The thing is that atheists are distinguished from others by atheos, being without God.
Right.
But humanists, on the other hand, as you've spoken to ethical culture, the Ethical Culture Society, probably Ann Clayson, we have religious humanists.
Right.
We have humanists who believe in God, which are a minority among our ranks. We have deists. We have humanist Unitarians, included some of those who don't believe in God as well. We have agnostics. We have atheists. It's a wide swath of individuals.
And my thought obviously tended more specifically to the atheists, but
Right.
but I also just internally to the Christian community is that we tend in our nomenclature, and I don't know if this went back or was popularized by Will Herberg in the 50s, Protestant, Catholic, Jew. And I can't tell you how many times people have talked about that as if they were three separate religious faiths. And frankly, for me, the term Protestant is one of those identifications by negative. What's a Protestant? Well, a Protestant is a Christian who was neither Roman Catholic nor Orthodox. But the difference, which frankly is not much, between a Methodist and a Lutheran and an Episcopalian and a Baptist and a et cetera, and a Roman Catholic, is not all that great. The style of polity, how this church is structured, what the authority structure is different. But the sense of common scripture, a lot of common tradition, and I don't know what the percentage would be, but I venture to say that it would probably be in the single-digit percentage of actual differences. But the differences would be as much between any of these denominations that are called Protestant as between any one of them and the Roman Catholic Church, with which Protestant seems to be identified as the antipathy. And so during my tenure with the Council of Churches, which of course was organized and understood itself back in the 1930s when it was organized to be an organization of Protestant churches, I tried my level best to almost expunge the word Protestant from my lexicon and talk in terms of Christian. Because I think it was not a meaningful distinction. And I still believe that to be so.
So for humanism, you mentioned canonical documents. We don't necessarily have canonical documents. We have an ongoing conversation, yes, with certain philosophers. Yet there's a couple of documents, three of them, that emerged in the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century called the Humanist Manifesto that generally cover the ethical and moral commitments of humanism. If we look at humanists, most of us don't believe in God, but we don't necessarily exclude those who do. Where our commitments to each other come from, it's more of the naturalistic explanation, because where you brought up the covenant with God in Genesis and all coming together and under that route, where humanists look at the world, we see that there's a language of mammal, and that language involves perspective taking, it involves altruism. So morality for humanists developed long before human beings walked this planet. And we look towards the social sciences and what the social sciences say about human behavior, which is increasingly going, it's increasingly coming towards and uniting towards what we've been saying philosophically for years, that for the most part, we're naturally inclined to be good. We can look at how we operate around other people. Number one, if we are removed and put in solitary confinement, it's torture. We suffer adverse physiological effects. Secondly, we can look not just at human beings, but we can look at our closest relatives, and they exhibit the same type of behavior, which is low-cost altruism as an impulsive act. For example, you're walking down the street and you see someone drop their wallet out of their pocket. Nearly everyone, there's some sociopaths out there who are just going to take advantage of the situation, but nearly everyone is going to stop that person, pick up the wallet, and hand it back. We see that behavior with bonobos and chimpanzees as well, where a researcher will leave an object just outside of their reach inside a chimp's enclosure, and they'll use a stick to grab at it. And this is research done by Franz de Waal at Emory University. He's an ethologist and primatologist. And we see that chimpanzees, without any directive of being trained, they'll walk over, pick up the object, and hand it to the researcher. And some of us agree with the golden rule, and others of us would say that the golden rule might be terribly solipsistic, because it like you mentioned earlier about just putting your own perspective on the rest of the population of humanity. We might go a little further into being more Kantians in that. And yeah, that might be taking the golden rule too literal of how would I see the world. You know, we might go more Kantian of what would be the best way for other people to act in that case. And from those perspectives of naturalistic ethics, from we are altruistic by nature. And like I said earlier, another person I want to bring up is David Pfaff, who is a neuroscientist who came out with a lovely book a few years ago called The Altruistic Brain Theory, which says that the way that our brains process information, that we have a potential action that we're going to put out, but if it's antisocial, and keep in mind, there are some sociopathic people out there. Unless it's antisocial, our brain is going to inhibit that social action. We are in-group living people. I could talk, I do actually have a talk on our YouTube site about this, but basically where we see this, we rationalize about this after the fact, after what biology informs us. And there is a book of this title called Good Without God that came out, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, from Greg Epstein, the humanist chaplain at Harvard, where you mentioned about uniting yourselves around the idea of absence of what you don't believe. But my version of humanism, the bumper sticker slogan is, we are humanists and we are here to help. And if you look at ethical culture, if you look at humanistic Judaism, if you look at humanist philosophers from the 20th century like Corliss Lamond, the idea is that, and I think that we're on the same page of where we owe something to the rest of society, that ideally, and how we should be acting, and we reinforce that behavior in other people. We are humanists and we are here to help. Regardless if a God exists or not, we still have the same moral commitments to and for each other. And I think that's the true basis of humanism. And we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but for humanists, we unite around that basic concept, that we have a naturalistic set of ethics, that we owe something to and for each other, and we have this greater relationship and this greater responsibility to the larger social group. And like I said earlier about how humanists might not have a God concept, might be against a God concept, or may be deeply religious believers, if we can come together and put our thoughts of God to the side and work together for the common cause of the betterment of everyone, I think that that's truly humanist, because it's doing so with joy, with a deep drive in finding meaning in that aspect of help. And we have a question from Jeremy.
Thank you. And Skip, thank you so much for being here. It was delightful to hear your perspectives and your wisdom. A couple of things. When you brought up the difference between Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, on the fun note, I would say the difference is 3,761 years. But and another thing you brought up about the golden rule not being in the Bible, you meant the New Testament, because I was confused about that, because I know it happens to be in Leviticus 19:18.
Well, it is. Yes, it is in the Old Testament, but let's see. Jesus was asked at one point. This is obviously New Testament. What do I have to do to get into heaven by a lawyer? Ask that question. To love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself, which is a restatement of the Leviticus. And again, that I'm sure that comes from other religious traditions earlier than Judaism. And what Jason said, I would agree with the core moral function that as you've outlined it in terms of commitment to one another, is something that we do share. I think the motivation from a person of faith is probably different because, in effect, we're called by God to do this, and that puts it in a different perspective from our perspective. It doesn't mean that we can't cooperate and work together, and obviously have on all kinds of things from the civil rights movement on down. I can't resist saying another religious liberty story. One of the things that has concerned me from a religious liberties perspective has been the effort by, I guess some people, to kind of stamp out anything that appears religious in the public sphere. And no more has this been seen in public school curricula. Obviously, there have been skirmishes on the other side of this issue, mostly in the Bible Belt. But where New York City public schools, for example, have basically expunged any reference to God and religion unless it's hostile, like a religious war or something, from the social studies curriculum. And when my son was in kindergarten, this goes back a number of years, I had him on my knee on Sunday in January, and I said, "Do you know why you have off from school tomorrow?" And to my surprise, he said, "It's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day." Okay. We had not talked about King or the civil rights movement with him in the household. And I paused when he gave me that answer. And then he went on for 2 paragraphs about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. And, this is kindergarten. He was barely 5 years old. And I was impressed. And I said, "Yeah, did you know that Dr. King was a minister?" Well, David was sitting on my knee. We were facing in the same direction, but then he suddenly turned his head like in The Exorcist, screwed up his face and said, "Yeah, right." And I said, "Yeah, he was a Baptist minister." "Sure." Well, that caused me to get the social studies text from the older kids. His brother was 6 years older, his sister 10. And somehow between the two of them, I got 3 social studies books. I don't know who had pilfered what. But in all 3 of the books, King was mentioned with the civil rights movement, which really was not well covered. The most coverage was about 2/3 of one page in one of the books. In only one book was King identified as Reverend, and in none of the books was there any reference to the broad public and religious community support for the civil rights movement. Now, what was said was accurate. It's just what wasn't said that would mislead people. I told that story. I was on a panel in DC a few years back where the people in the audience were PhD candidates from Baylor University in education. And the professor with whom I had a long relationship brought his students each year first to the state capitol in Texas, and at the end of their second year to Washington, and their third year to Geneva, to talk about basically the proper relationship of how to teach about religion in schools, not to isolate it, but what's proper from a legal standpoint as well as a good pedagogical standpoint. So I told that story. And one of the PhD candidates, who herself was a high school teacher in Texas, came up to me afterward and said, I've got that story and I can go you one better. And she proceeded to say that she each year in her 11th grade social studies class would play Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which is about 8 minutes long. And on one occasion, there was a student who came up to her afterward and was all enthused by what he had heard in the King speech. And his first comment was, "That guy was great. He could have been a preacher." Which is how dummied down education has become in this country, particularly as it respects religion. Now, some argue that this came from the Supreme Court decision in 63 and 4 on prayer in the public schools, decisions, by the way, which I fully support. But, it gave rise to the idea that we can't even talk about it. When there was a kerfluffle in the New York City system, I don't remember what year now, but a curriculum office in the Board of Education had developed what they called the Rainbow Curriculum, which was intended to be a curriculum on inclusivity, racially. We got a lot of immigrants in New York City, and especially in Queens, and so forth. And the conflict was over homosexuality. There were within this about, you can't see how wide my fingers are, but about a 2-inch thick book that was actually the curriculum for just the first and second grade. They hadn't yet written the ones for the upper grades, but this, created a firestorm in some local school boards within the city over the issue of homosexuality, claiming that this was encouraging and teaching favorably about homosexuality. And so the Board of Education quickly organized meetings, particularly with clergy. Not that there were a lot of clergy that were in on this campaign against the curriculum, but I attended one of these meetings. There were about 50 of my colleagues in Brooklyn, and they passed out copies of the curriculum, which I've kept. And as they're talking about it, and I'm thumbing through the curriculum, and I come to the section on teaching about religion. Now, bear in mind, again, this was for first and second graders. And I was actually surprised because they basically were affirming in the curriculum that there should be some teaching about religion, not a catechetical approach, and certainly not to evangelize, but to teach about. And there were separate sections in there suggesting that, about Judaism, you ought to teach this. And a lot of it had to do with centering on the holidays of the different faiths, using that as a jumping off point. And I have long felt before this that was probably the better way to do it. And
I think that we would agree on this, that there should be some education about religion in the public.
Well, let me finish in 15 seconds. The thing that struck me, though, is that while they had affirmative sections on Judaism, on Islam, on probably Hinduism, maybe Buddhism, I'm not sure, that was as much a lesser presence. On Christianity, it was all about what you cannot do. And so there was a completely different approach. And I think that, it's really important for all people to have at least some foundational understanding about the different faiths. I mean, I had to learn mine on the fly outside of Christianity. And particularly in a community like New York, and increasingly the whole country is becoming diverse like this, it's good to know what the neighbor thinks and believes and why. You don't have to share that belief, but to kind of understand them.
Well, and that leads to the follow-up question I had when you brought up the split between the Anglican Church and what created the Methodist Church.
Mhm.
Does that go all the way back to the split between Martin Luther, the Calvinists, and Methodism?
I think each of those is quite separate. I mean, Luther's dispute was not so much theological, though it was couched in theological terms, but they had a fundraising scheme to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which was selling indulgences. And I don't know, they probably had enough lumber to build, a whole subdivision out of what presumed to be the cross. And he felt this was taking advantage. And, so that spawned his argument. He had other arguments with him. What, of course, most people who are called Protestants and others don't realize is that within the century, there was a counter-reformation within the Catholic Church to clean up those acts. But that was other than the East-West Orthodox split in the, what was it, the 11th century, the Martin Luther's split in 15, whatever it was, 88 or something, 15, that's not right year, 1500s anyway, really was the first Protestant, as in protest, reformation. And so my point on the word Protestant is that pertains obviously historically to the Lutherans, but really not to anybody else. They traded under those terms. But Calvinism, Calvin's Institutes and the notion of predestination, which tended to motivate many of the dissenters from England that migrated, I guess, to Scotland before they came over as colonists here in the 1600s, and still surfaces in different ways. That was a completely different strand, and the Anabaptist, each of these was almost sui generis with a particular founder. And as I said, the Anglican separation was over a political dispute over divorce of the king in order that he could marry a queen that could present him with an heir to the throne. And it didn't really change doctrine. It just changed who controlled. And Wesley, obviously broke from that reluctantly, as I explained, but his intention was to create, I would say, something like a Jesuit order in the Anglican Church, reformation, an evangelical order within the church.
Can I ask a question? I can't find the hand raise feature here. I'm sorry about that. Skip?
They've cut off everybody's hands. It's their Sharia law.
So
Go ahead.
thanks. You're on the right track there. I want to go back to the tribalism and the family and the religion and the identity, and not necessarily just honor killings. And if I understood why would he or she want to do that? What do you think is the basis, the psychological basis of ownership, the audacity I find, where religion, the tribe, the family, but especially the religion gets its status to own its participants, claim adherents that are not necessarily followers or people want to leave. You see this certainly in the family unit a lot. Sorry, I have a lot of ambient noise coming up. So what do you think about that? Because I think it goes too unquestioned for too long. And I think especially it's harsh on women, and it goes without question. I question it. I don't think that people necessarily belong to their tribe, their family, or their religion. Religion is unique as an institution for taking that type of rank where, even political party, for instance, doesn't have that kind of claim. They have to sort of work to keep people in.
Gee, I thought that's what Trump was all about. I don't think it's so much of an institutional claim. on the person. I think it certainly is the shared common understanding, in the culture, really.
It's a psychological drive. No, I don't think it's institutional. I think it's that institutions like religion have it, and that is unique. But I think, whether they're religious leaders or heads of household or other people with a rank and status, there is a psychological identity, that this sense of entitlement that they can do that to other people, which is, I think, very contrary to the thesis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or I was going to say Humanist Manifesto, which borrows heavily from that.
I do think that the issue of identity is at the core of this, but it's an acceptance of identity for the most part. Obviously, there's rebellion, and people do go out and in the in the Middle East, the penalty for that is often being disowned religiously in previous centuries, and to some degree today with the fundamentalist churches, people will be disfellowshipped for that. But that's not a common practice across the board. People are not disowned, or said, if you leave us, you're going to die, type of thing, or we're going to go after and get you or something. People do come and go. And I mean, that's one of the accusations that's been made against some new religious movements, that they, hold people captive. And by and large, that's untrue. I mean, there have been some examples of that, but they are rare. I think it's an identity that is accepted and it's shared because in a given culture, if everybody accepts that premise, it's kind of hard to go against that. I mean, it's not really a mob psychology, but it there would be some elements of that it's a shared and agreed upon, or maybe not so much agreed upon, but you grow up in that, and that's what you come to know. And again, it was a trilogy there. It was family, faith, and tribe. I mean, I call it tribe. They would call it nation today. But the Universal Declaration being somewhat more of a Western European and American creation, had a greater aspect of freedom of the individual or individual rights as against, that kind of tradition. And frankly, you look at some of these less developed societies, including, I mean, Arab is pretty well developed now, but they're probably only trailing, depending on the issue, on feminism or whatever, 50 to 100 or 150 years behind the so-called Western nations. I mean, we were like that 200 years ago in terms of, gender roles that were pretty rigid and so forth.
So Andreas has a question.
No, I was just going to add two things. First of all, I think, I think the Western focus on the individual and, as an individual identity is the exception around the world. And, I think, even in ancient Greece, one of the worst things that could happen to you was you would be banished. You would be exiled from your polity. And, and that was, losing your identity completely. So that's, so the tribe connection, that's very basic human thing.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that sometimes people say, oh, it's part of my religion, when it's just part of tradition. A lot of these things in the Middle East predate Islam.
Oh, no question. And it's shared otherwise. I mean, it's not just Islam that ties into these things, but that seemed to be a regional cultural kind of thing. At least that's the way I took it from the discussions we had with the leaders in Egypt.
Yeah, we often take our things we're accustomed to as being reasonable and rational, but
right.
Look at it from that perspective. That's really all.
Yeah, intuitively we're right, and that means everybody else is wrong. And that's obviously not a good way to get along.
And a lot of the more conservative, restrictive, authoritarian aspects come from this whole thing called the resource curse, where you have a country that has a huge stock in a mineral commodity and it just breeds authoritarianism. So that's seeing countries in the Middle East and North Africa being so incredibly repressive. But then we can look at other countries that have large Muslim populations. And before Europe, before the United States, there were plenty of states that had women as presidents and prime ministers, for example.
Hmm.
A lot of it
Yeah.
comes down to Arab culture and oil and natural gas.
Well, if you've got the coin, you can call the shot, um, type of thing. But again, it's not just that. I mean, I think of you know some of the stuff that's been going on in France for the last few decades is really terrible, especially about religion. But the law that they just passed, which has nothing to do with religion, or didn't just pass, but it's come into force, saying essentially that it's a crime to publish the photograph of a police officer. Um, so the surveillance camera that took the full account of police beating up on an innocent civilian, which is what has put this out to the fore. But they've passed laws forbidding wearing of religious symbols. Um, and a lot of this has been to go after Muslims. But before that, in the 90s, they were going after the new religious movements with a vengeance. They published a list of some 170 odd groups, include about a third of them being actually alternative medicine groups, vitamin groups, and so forth. But that were considered in our parlance here to be dangerous cults. And and when I was at meetings in France and also in Germany and other European countries in the 90s and early 2000s to discuss some of these matters, it seemed to me, and particularly pre 9/11, that these were stalking horses because of the increase of the Muslim population in the Western European countries. And then, of course, 9/11 just let loose and said it's okay publicly to bash the Muslims. And I mean, the idea that it was overturned by a court decision in France, but that they could disallow the burkini. The Muslim woman not wanting to be immodest in a bikini had designed a swimwear that was, shall we say, not revealing at all. And there were jurisdictions in France that said, you can't do that. You can't do that.
How did the alternative medicine and the vitamin groups fall under the umbrella in the same
Good
way?
question. It was probably lobbying on behalf of the official medicine groups, my guess. Um, but they were, I guess, presumed to be recruiting and therefore deviating from an official party line on certain subjects, in this case, medical treatment, much like the so-called cults, or what in Europe are referred to as sects. French is SECTE. They kind of reverse the two words. We think of sect as a nascent religion, and a cult is something that's dangerous, and they've got it the other way around. The cult is perfectly fine, but the sect is the dangerous one. And it's recruitment, and of course France has got a bad history of this with secularism. The seizure of all church property in 1905 and then nationalizing it, is part and parcel of that. Now, they did allow the congregations to use the building, and of course the government pays for it. But and the status is very different than here. But it ultimately winds up, from the standpoint of the religious community, it's disenabling, because where the church is established as to government funding, it saps the necessity of the congregation, the members, to take care for what's needed. I'm getting a bit of an echo in my you're on this. I don't
Let's see. I'm seeing if I can.
know.
So,
No, okay. Whatever happened stopped it. I was hearing myself back, is what I was saying. Anyway, that's that hurts. I mean, we call it stewardship in terms of the fundraising aspect within the church, and if the church isn't responsible for it, people just take it for granted, and their commitments are less significant. And I've seen that operate within local churches where different things have happened, either because they have a windfall of money and now we don't need to pass the plate as often or whatever. But it certainly comes from the standpoint, um, South Americans, Hispanic, many Pentecostals, many Roman Catholic, emigrating to the States. At least this was the experience in New York. Don't have any sense of needing to support the church because the government paid. And, and that tends to be true in other places and in different ways. And that, as I said, saps initiative and responsibility, and ultimately is a destructive element.
all right. So I want to open this up for people who feel like they might not have had a chance to ask a question yet.
I have an objection to you saying that Saudi Arabia is 200 years behind the United States, because I feel like we're falling back into patriarchy here in the United States. I don't feel like we're moving forward. And I really feel like, especially with the evangelicals, they want women to just be childbearers and silent house servants. And we have the least amount of representation of women in all the different governmental organizations. So it's really hard for me to think we're moving forward. It really feels like we're moving backwards rapidly.
I'm not going to dispute that, but I don't think that's broadly across the whole society. I mean, it's obviously a significant element. And I was really talking more not just about the US, but Western culture generally.
Yes, they do have equity in the Scandinavian countries and equity in a lot of the European nations, with women being on boards, CEOs and things like that. It's just America seems to be caught in the 50s in a lot of ways.
Well, yes and no. And of course, it depends on where you're looking. I mean, the number of women governors and mayors, and they've shown up on the news in this election cycle in great numbers, the women, is something that you would not have seen 50 years ago. So, I mean, that's a dramatic change. Obviously, there has not yet been a female president. That could conceivably change in the next election or two. But and to that degree, we're behind some of the other Western nations. But my real point was that wherever this is, there is I won't say a movement because that implies somebody's driving it, but there is a change which comes slowly, and that a lot of the less, what had been considered the less developed countries, more tribal type lands, you look back as to what life was like in the United States 200 years ago on a lot of these issues, and other than perhaps brutality, but I guess there was some of that in the U.S. too. And I'm not talking about slavery. That is a completely different institution. Where I guess what I'm saying is give some of the other cultures time to adapt, because if you go in and demand a change in this or that aspect, what you're doing is somehow the culture has managed to survive because there's an equilibrium within it. And then you change one or two elements and you throw the balance completely out of whack, and things wind up become chaotic, even anarchy. But evolution tends to smooth that out. It just takes time, as it has in the United States.
I would,
Uh,
I would, I would venture a bit of a disagreement on that with Saudi, because the sponsorship of the West, because of the massive oil reserves, has kept a crime family in there for generations now. And we can look at the surrounding states, and women are allowed to drive. And yes, women are allowed to drive with restrictions in Saudi right now, but that's just recent. And Patricia brings up the aspect of women's rights in Saudi. And I thought I would just bring up one name, because this is so critically important right now. There's an individual by the name of Lujain al-Hatalul, and she was one of the leading women's rights activists who was driving a couple years ago. And right now, she has just been transferred to a special terrorism court because she fought back against the government for the right to drive. It's legal for women to drive with male escort permission, but right before then, Ms. Hatlul was driving, and now she is going to a terrorism court, and she's being charged in the special court for terrorism and national security crimes with charges such as seeking to change the kingdom's political system, campaigning for women's rights, and communicating with foreign journalists, diplomats, and human rights organizations. And I don't want to change the topic too much, but just because this is so recent and it just happened, we have to bring her name up and recognize that when we're talking about Saudi, while things are abysmal in terms of women's rights in Jordan and in Kuwait and in Iran, Saudi is such a special case. It's an artificial case. Looking
yeah,
at
and your point initially about the dictators being funded and protected by us in particular, we do have a penchant for doing that, don't we? You know, that's problematic, and you know, I was speaking more broadly.
Yeah.
But even there, you know, come back in 100 years and see what it looks like. You know, I can't imagine that it would be exactly the same.
All right, Jeremy, you have a question. Not Jeremy, Andreas, you have a question.
Yeah, I would say, you know, it's not only the Middle East. I mean, in India, you have cases of dowry killings and, you know, and a lot of rapes that go unpunished and things like that. One thing is, you know, bringing, you know, in these countries, in many cases, you have people who 2-3 generations ago were living in tribal, you know, nomadic
Right.
kind of, you know, cultures, and now suddenly they're thrust into modernity. And you know, in the 60s and 70s, there was a book called Future Shock, if some of you might remember.
Yeah.
And that's what's going on. You know, I mean, there's a clash between the, you know, the sort of the Bedouin culture and modernity. You know, and I think that's what's creating a lot of the conflict there. So it's
Well,
not necessarily religion.
Right. And that's part of my point of saying, you know, if we as Westerners try to adjust this aspect because we don't like it, it's going to cause that to blow apart. Which isn't to say that we don't, but leading by example, and as they engage economically and otherwise with the rest of the world, inevitably their culture is going to change. But it's a hard move to go from a tribal to a kind of a national state. In the first instance, and this takes time. You know, we didn't instantly have that, and on the religious side of things, back in colonial times in the United States, or what became the United States, you know, the school book story is that the Pilgrims came for religious freedom. Well, they left out the rest of the sentence. They came for religious freedom for me, but not for thee.
Same in Calvin in Switzerland. You know, that's where I'm from.
Exactly. And
like Ayatollah in Geneva.
Now it tended to an equilibrium was reached because there was so much land that the people that couldn't get along in this settlement could set up their own settlement 100 miles down the road. And the few examples that you had of Roger Williams in Providence, for example, saying that, anyone of religion is welcome, except even there, that wasn't totally true, because the Quakers were driven out of both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And when they came to New York, or to the tail end of the eastern end of Long Island, and the Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, got word of that in the 1650s, he sent out a decree telling everybody within the New Amsterdam territory that they weren't to welcome the Quakers, because they were, I forget the word now, well, they were in effect evil people with evil thoughts. Don't let them, don't give them work, don't give them lodging, and whatever you do, don't give them a place where they can have their terrible worship. And it was in Queens in 1857 that a group of settlers in the community that's now called Flushing demurred on that and sent a letter back to Stuyvesant saying that what you have demanded we cannot do, because that would put us in blasphemy with God. Those who come in peace we will welcome in peace. And that caused Stuyvesant to arrest half of the people who signed the letter, which was virtually all of the male townsmen there, and until they recanted, but others didn't, and it led to a big discussion and movement, and the jailing of many, and finally, that which is known as the Flushing Remonstrance became known as the first statement of excuse me, the first statement on these shores, arguing for religious freedom for someone else. And that was in 1657. So, I mean, it's been an uneven movement, even here. And the constitutional protection that we cherish, boy, my mouth is getting dry, is almost unique to America, and to some degree, the Bill of Rights has given rise to various UN documents, including the International Declaration, and that has come through court decisions to be kind of molded, not necessarily authentically, in recent years, and we're seeing a back and forth ebb and flow of that today.
I have a comment.
Go ahead, Jim.
My son gave me the wrong code number. It took me over 2 hours to finally get on the internet, and I'm going to wring his neck when he gets home.
Well, you got to get the right address.
Amen.
All right, Jim. So as we're now past 2 hours, I just have another question just about how we can understand each other. I hope that you've enjoyed your time with us today with the Humanist Association, Skip.
I certainly have. Thank you.
I think that I personally, I don't know if I could speak for the group, but I personally have really enjoyed our chat. But do you have advice for believers to better understand atheists, or for atheists to better understand believers?
Well, I think, and we've talked about a lot of these things, there are a lot of social issues that we could certainly agree on, not necessarily coming from the same philosophical or theological underpinning, but agree on what the a common result ought to be. And certainly we can and should feel comfortable in working together on that. And I suspect that the perspective of at least some within the humanist societies is that religious people are out to convert, And obviously there are some religious people for whom that is a strong motivation, but that's not universally so. And frankly, going back to the example that I cited from Egypt in terms of the identity of people, that wound up being a good thing, because there really was no and is no effort on behalf of one of these religious communities to convert somebody from the other community. That you were born X and Y views you as being authentically X, that's fine. What has created havoc is actually with some missionary types, particularly evangelical, who've come in and tried to upset that balance. So there is an acceptance of the difference, and that, that your commitment is as good as my commitment. And my guess is that just because of the disparity of population, there is less opportunity for Christians in particular to encounter humanists in numbers. And so there's a lack of knowledge. And, I don't know what can be done to alleviate that, but the degree to which differences in every respect are, come to be known. And much like the discussion of teaching about religion in school, the different world religions and the like, it helps to know what the neighbor believes. And I would say that, how you've described it, there is a belief system among humanists, that it come to educate on that.
Well, thank you so much. Everyone, please unmute yourselves and give another warm round of San Diego applause to the Reverend Skip LaRue.
Well, I thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was informative.